morning class. This is ECON 353 macroeconomics class. Today is March 1st, Tuesday. Class will cover the second half of chapter 8. Remember that chapter 8 is the most important chapter of the course, which is the aggregate expenditure and equivalent national income determination. Here are the order of today's video clips. Number 1, autonomous investment. 2, expenditure approach and savings approach. 3, applications of the multipliers. 4, case study of the paradox of drift. 6, aggregate expenditure model. Let's watch the video clips.
We're building a model of the macroeconomy, and this model that we're building is based on the idea of John Maynard Keynes, that the economy is, at its heart, driven by demand. The model that we're building is called the aggregate expenditure model. Aggregate expenditure meaning demand, what people are planning to spend. And I want to begin with the circular flow diagram and connect this familiar picture with the graphs that we've been drawing to represent aggregate expenditure in the macroeconomy. We're working towards a notion of equilibrium that's going to help you understand how the macroeconomy works and to predict how the macroeconomy will change when the economic environment changes around it. So let's go back to the circular flow diagram and look at its heart. The heart of the circular flow of resources in the economy is the relationship between consumers, that is households, and businesses or firms. Resources flow in this direction. Consumers put labor, capital, raw materials into the factor markets, where they are hired by firms who use them to produce goods and services. These goods and services are then purchased by households. This purchase is called consumer spending. So as resources are flowing clockwise around this diagram, money is flowing counterclockwise. That is, the money that consumers pay in goods and services markets for goods and services is called consumer spending. And here's the real consumer spending, the real goods and services going into the household. This money then winds up in firms, and firms use this money to pay for the land, labor, and capital, that is the factors of production that they've used to make the goods and services. And that money winds back up in the hands of households as income. So what we have here is consumer spending on goods and services that winds up in the firms who use this money to pay for the resources that created the goods and services. A nice, tight, balanced circular flow. If consumer spending is the only element of demand, then it must be true that in equilibrium, what consumers are spending, that is, what they are paying for goods and services, winds up exactly right back in their hands as income, that is, as wages, interest payments, rent, and profits from business. So there's a balance here. Spending equals income. Now you can imagine that we could introduce another factor into this story that would disrupt this balance. Let's suppose that there's money that flows out of this circle, that is a leakage out of the circular flow in the form of taxes. That is, consumers have their income reduced because they have to pay money to the government in the form of taxes. So let's put another green arrow here that indicates money flowing into the government. Well, how is this going to affect the overall flow of resources? If consumers have to divert some of their income into the government in the form of tax payments, that reduces the amount that they can spend on goods and services. Firms, in turn, will respond to this reduced demand by producing less output, which means they're going to be hiring fewer resources in the factor markets, which in turn is going to reduce consumer income. So this leakage out of the system causes everything to be upset. The balance is upset, and everything has to adjust until a new equilibrium is established. We're going to see that process more clearly, I believe, over in the aggregate expenditure diagram. So let's take the idea from the circular flow and now translate it into a picture over here in this aggregate expenditure diagram. Here we have it, the aggregate expenditure curve that we've been drawing before. The black dotted line represents points where income is equal to aggregate expenditure or total spending. These are the points of equilibrium or balance in the macroeconomy where people are buying everything that the factories are producing, and they're paying for it with the income that they get when the factories pay them their paychecks. The red line represents the consumption function that we've developed before. Its intercept representing autonomous consumption, and the slope representing the marginal propensity to consume, that fraction of each additional dollar of income that consumers spend on goods and services rather than saving. Think now about the consumption function. We've talked about it before. The consumption function is what we've drawn in this picture. And in order to draw this line in this graph, we have to hold things constant. Consumption, spending plans depend on autonomous consumption, that is what you have to buy regardless of what your income and other factors are, your bare necessities. It also is going to depend on your wealth. How much do you have in your mutual funds and your savings accounts? It will also depend on your income, and that's what the diagram is all about. As income increases, you will do more consuming, especially if you are credit constrained. That is, if you have to have a paycheck in order to do any shopping. However, if you can get credit, you're more likely to do shopping. That is, the easier it is to borrow money, the more likely it is that you will be spending on goods and services. Another factor is taxes. That is, the more the government takes out of your paycheck in the form of taxes, the less you have to spend. The smaller is your disposable income. There's also the matter of prices. As prices increase, even though we've adjusted for the effect on your income, that is, we're measuring real consumption as a function of real income, when prices increase, your savings account then seems to be smaller. That is, your $100,000 saving has a smaller purchasing power when the price level rises, and that can cause you to do less consumption. There are other factors that influence your behavior, like expectations. What do you think the future holds? Are you expecting a raise next year? You might spend some of it now. But we hold all of those other factors constant. Whenever we draw this picture, we assume that the only thing changing is your consumer income. If we allow something else to change, we have to draw this consumption function all over again. That is, suppose we imagine that consumer wealth increases, perhaps due to a boom in the stock market. If the stock market booms and people feel wealthier, then the consumption function shifts upwards. This indicates that at any given level of income that you choose, consumers, rather than planning to spend this much on goods and services, are now spending a larger amount. Spending plans have increased due to a sense of increased wealth. If consumers are planning to spend more money at any given income level, then you have to shift the consumption function upwards. On the other hand, if taxes were to increase, that is, if the government takes a bigger chunk of consumer income, then the consumption function shifts downwards, showing at any given income level now, consumers are planning to spend less than they were planning to spend before, because their disposable income has shrunk. We could show the effect of taxes in our mathematical expression for the consumption function. We could do it this way. Consumption is equal to autonomous consumption plus the marginal propensity to consume times this quantity, income minus taxes. You might call this thing in parentheses your disposable income. And when taxes increase, consumption is going to be reduced. Notice, however, that consumption is not going to be reduced by the full amount of any tax burden. Why is that? Because the increase in taxes effectively reduces your income. But not all of that is going to feed directly into a reduction in consumption. Some of that additional tax payment is going to come out of your savings account, right? Because anytime you get extra money, you save some of it and you spend the rest. Well, when your income is pulled down by taxes, some of that comes from a reduction in your consumption, but the rest of it comes from a reduction in your savings. That's why an increase in taxes does not have a one-for-one effect on reducing your consumption. Part of the increase in taxes is paid for by a reduction in your savings. Well, let's go back now to the circular flow diagram, because consumption is only one part of the circular flow. It's probably the most important part, and as I've said before, it's the heart of this circular flow story. But there are other leakages and injections that modify the diagram. We've already talked about the leakage of taxes. Taxes flow out of the system, reducing consumption. But there are other spending that goes into the system that increases the overall level of economic activity. One of these is government spending. The government spends on goods and services flow out of the goods market into the government, where the government uses them to provide for public assistance, to provide for public goods and other things. So government money goes into the goods and services market, and goods and services flow into the government. This little exchange is called government spending. Another injection of demand into the system is businesses spending. That is, goods and services flow into businesses in the form of investment spending, plant, equipment, capital goods that businesses acquire, and businesses pay for them by spending money in the goods and services market. So here we have investment spending. This is the spending on drill presses, plant, factories, and, importantly, inventories. When businesses acquire inventories and build them up in their warehouses, this is a form of investment spending. Another injection into the system is the spending of foreigners. So whenever foreigners import our products into their countries, then we experience that as net exports. That is, the flow of goods and services abroad, which is foreigners buying our goods, less the goods we buy from them. We call this exchange net exports. So net exports, government spending, and investment spending are all injections of demand into the system, just like taxes were a leakage out of the circular flow. So we can go through and label all of these with their names. This exchange right here is called consumption. This exchange right here, this one-way leakage, is called taxes. Right here, we have the government buying goods and services. We call that government spending. This exchange is called business spending or investment. And up here, we have net exports. We use these symbols over and over in our analysis of aggregate expenditure. And the flow down here from firms out of what's left over into the households is income. In the end, income is going to be everything that households are spending, less the leakages, like taxes, plus the injections, government spending, business spending, and the spending of foreigners. Now, let's go over and represent this into our aggregate expenditure diagram. You see, because what we're doing now is we're adding other spending. The red line that we've drawn before represented the behavior of consumers. This was consumption as a function of income. Now, however, we want to add in the spending of everybody else. So I put in another red line. And notice, I've made this horizontal because these choices are autonomous. That is, the government, businesses, all of that spending for the moment we are imagining does not depend on income. It's independent of income. So it enters our model as a constant, also called exogenous, determined outside the model. Well, if you add government, business, and foreign spending onto the spending of consumers, then you have to do this horizontal addition. If this is 10 right here, you've got to add it on to this line at every point, shift it up by the amount of 10. This is called a vertical summation. Just add it on vertically, and the line shifts up. So now what we have is aggregate expenditure is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. That's what aggregate expenditure is all about. And here's how you show it in the picture. Take the consumption function, consumer spending as a function of income, and add on all of these other spending plans, the spending plan of business, government, and foreigners. And that now gives you a line that we can call the aggregate expenditure line. The aggregate expenditure is a function, so I'm using parentheses here to denote that, is a function of income because consumer spending increases as income increases according to the marginal propensity to consume. But for the moment, all of those other factors, all of those other leakages and injections, we are taking as constant. They don't depend directly on income, and therefore they can be represented by this horizontal line and added onto vertically the consumption function to give us the new aggregate expenditure line. So now we're headed towards an equilibrium. The equilibrium is going to have the same idea as that circular flow, that when you consider leakages and injections, everything has to balance. And we got this cast of characters, consumers, businesses, the government, and foreigners, whose spending plans have to, in equilibrium, balance the output of factories. I'm here at the bank making a deposit in my savings account and feeling very virtuous, because our culture regards saving as a virtue. However, what makes sense for one person, that is, what's good for me to do, may be bad if everyone tries to do it at once. This was an insight of John Maynard Keynes. He says, think about it. When you're saving, you're not spending. And if everyone reduces their spending at once, they may create a recession. This is what he called the paradox of thrift. That is, when I come to the bank and put my money in the vault, I am at that same moment making a decision not to spend it. And when I don't spend, I am reducing aggregate demand. And when I reduce aggregate demand, I am reducing income for someone else down the line. That is, my decision to put money in the bank is a decision not to buy a compact disc, which means that the record store owner won't be buying ice cream, which means that the ice cream vendor won't be buying a t-shirt. And the multiplier effect works in reverse, causing the economy to contract. Think about this. Savings has two components. There's autonomous savings, the amount that you're going to save regardless of what your income is. And then there's that amount of savings that depends on your income. For each additional dollar in income that you get, you're going to be saving a fraction of it, called the marginal propensity to save. So here's what happens. Savings is a leakage out of the flow of goods and services. If everyone increases their autonomous savings, what they're doing is reducing demand, which means that businesses are going to cut back production, and income is going to be falling. Eventually, what happens is that savings has to be equal to investment. That's our condition for macroeconomic equilibrium. So if investment is autonomous, that means if it's a fixed amount, then what has to happen is the amount by which we have increased autonomous savings has to be the amount by which the economy reduces savings based on income. Income is going to shrink until savings falls to be exactly equal to the level that it was before everyone tried to save more. This means that since savings equals income, our efforts to try to increase our aggregate savings are fruitless. And the only thing that's accomplished is a reduction in gross domestic product. People stop spending, businesses stop creating goods and services, and the economy shrinks. This may be what happened during the Great Depression. People were fearful for the future and tried to save more money, but when they did, they didn't spend, and therefore stores closed down, and people didn't have jobs, and income fell further, and the economy contracted. The same thing may have happened in Japan. The Japanese have a reputation for saving a lot. This was great during the 50s and 60s when there was a lot of productive capital investment to be undertaken. However, in the 80s and 90s, it worked against Japan because their economy was in a recession and everyone was trying to save. And when the foreign sectors stopped keeping the economy afloat, the Japanese economy contracted further. They were saving too much. And it wasn't until the government started spending for the economy that the economy began to grow again. My brother and I have this argument. He says that I should spend more and do my part to create jobs and help the economy grow. I believe, however, that I am doing my part for the economy whenever I put money in the bank. That's because there's a component to the story of the paradox of thrift that I think is oversimplified. And that's the idea that investment is autonomous. In fact, investment spending depends on the interest rate. And when the interest rate is lower, businesses are likely to come to the bank, borrow more money, and build more factories and install more equipment. So what happens when I bring my money into the bank is that I increase the supply of loanable funds, pushing down the interest rate and encouraging businesses to borrow more. Once you allow the interest rate to vary and businesses to respond to lower interest rates, then savings can equal investment at a higher level. That is, more savings means more investment in equilibrium. And my savings actually doesn't deter the economy from growth. In fact, I'm encouraging businesses to install capital stock that's going to help the economy grow faster in the long run. So the paradox of thrift depends on a very simple view of the economy, one in which investment spending is autonomous. But if you introduce the interest rate and allow increased savings to push the interest rate down, then you can reason your way out of the paradox. Keynes was smart to come up with this idea, the idea that savings is the opposite of spending. Therefore, the more you save, the less you spend, and you may cause the economy to shrink. On the other hand, once you reintroduce the variable interest rate and see how savings is linked to the interest rate, you can see that putting your money in the bank is usually a very good idea because it makes credit easier to get for businesses and in the long run increases our standard of living. we're building a Keynesian model of the macroeconomy, and that means we're talking about demand. Right now, we're going to focus on one particular component of demand, and that's the behavior of businesses, so-called investment spending. We're going to look at how businesses make the decision about how much to spend on capital goods, plant and equipment and inventories, and we're going to look at how investment spending influences the circular flow. I want to start, though, by clearing up a misconception that many people bring to macroeconomics. When you hear the term investment, you probably think first about money you put in the bank or money that you put in a mutual fund, making an investment in a company. Well, when macroeconomists talk about that kind of activity, they use the term savings. So I'm going to use the term savings to refer to any form in which you save money, whether it's in a bank, in a mutual fund, buying stocks or bonds, anything like that. We're going to call that savings. When I use the term investment, on the other hand, I'm referring to this little interaction right here. When businesses buy goods and services in order to increase their productivity, the purchase of capital equipment by businesses. That's what we mean when we say investment. It also includes the accumulation of inventories, and I'm going to have something to say about inventories towards the end of this discussion. So now let's go to a representation of investment behavior. That is, let's go to a picture of how businesses choose to spend money on capital equipment. What is it that influences the amount of investment spending that businesses are doing? Well, there are several things. First of all, there's the unpredictability of the life of capital goods. That is, you buy a piece of equipment, it could break tomorrow, and then you have to go replace it. So there's a certain amount of spending on tools and plant and equipment that businesses have to do just to replace stuff that's worn out and broken. That is, just to cover the depreciation. Depreciation is sometimes unpredictable, and therefore businesses will spend sometimes on goods and services when they hadn't planned on doing so. Another thing that influences the decision to buy plant and equipment is new innovations. Whenever new tools, better tools, are created by inventors, businesses then have an incentive to go out and acquire those. We've seen a lot of that in our economy in the last decade as firms and businesses have gone out and purchased lots and lots of computers, which they're now trying to figure out how to use to increase their productivity in business. Another thing that influences investment expenditure is the expectation of profits. If you have new business opportunities, say new markets open up, or free trade agreements give you access to a market that was previously closed, or the cost of production falls due to diminished prices of some key resource. Anything that improves your business opportunities and makes it look like there's more profit down the road is going to lead you to invest now, to expand your business and take advantage of those opportunities. So the more profits you see, the more profitable your business opportunity is, the more likely you are to build factories, buy equipment, and engage in investment spending to increase the size of your operation and make the profits that you see coming. Well, there's also then the issue of interest rates. Interest rates are a very, very big factor in both the amount of investment spending that businesses do and the timing of investment spending. Let's think about how this works. You're a business or an entrepreneur, and you've got a certain amount of capital. Let's say you have $100,000, and you have a decision. Should you put this money in the bank where you can earn an interest rate of 5%, or should you invest it in your own business where you can make profits? And maybe $100,000 put in a business today returns you $150,000 next year. Well, $150,000 after you put in $100,000, that's a 50% rate of return. That's much better than the 5% that you could have earned in the bank. Now, certainly, you've got to adjust that for risk, and you've got to adjust that for any taxes that you pay on your profits. But all in all, it looks like the investment spending and the business opportunity are giving you a better return on your money than the bank is. Now, the bank return tells you what other people are willing to pay to get your money. And the interest rate that others are willing to pay is a signal of the profitability of their own business opportunities. So it's kind of you deciding, can I make more money with this investment if I do my own business, or could I do better by lending it to someone else and getting a share of their profits? Another way of thinking about this is, suppose you're in business and you want to expand your warehouse or add a wing onto your factory or buy some new machines. it is likely that you will have to borrow the money to do that transaction. And if you borrow the money, the cost of getting the money is the interest rate. If you are borrowing money at a rate of interest of 10%, and you are able to earn a 20% return on that money, then that still leaves you 20% minus the 10% interest, a 10% profit after you've paid for the cost of your money. The higher the interest rate, the less of your profit is left for you, and the more of it goes to the bank. And if the interest rate is too high, then even after you've made a profit, there's not enough left to pay the interest. It's not worth it to go into business because you can't earn a return that's high enough to cover the cost of the money you would have to borrow to acquire the buildings and the equipment to do the business. So as interest rates go up, fewer and fewer projects are profitable for a business to undertake. When interest rates go down and the cost of money is lower, more and more business opportunities appear profitable. Let's show that in a diagram. On the vertical axis, let's put the interest rate, and I'll indicate the interest rate by the letter I. On the vertical axis, or on the horizontal axis, we'll put a capital I to represent the total amount of investment spending that a business undertakes. So let's now order the projects that a business could undertake in order of their decreasing rate of return. So for instance, say project number 1 involves spending 10 on goods, capital goods. And let's say the rate of return on that is going to be 20%. So maybe this is buying new computers for your business, and the rate of return is 20%. So at a 20% rate of return, you're just indifferent between buying those computers and not. Say when the interest rate falls down to 15%, then another project becomes profitable. Maybe this is building a new warehouse and adding inventories. So at a rate of 15%, you could afford to borrow money and break even on this investment project. At a lower interest rate, say 10%, some other investment project might become profitable, and that would then add to the total amount of investment spending this business would like to do, and so forth. So you can imagine, at every interest rate along the way, it might be that some project that was previously unprofitable, some project whose rate of return was not high enough to cover the interest rate, becomes profitable, or at least breaks even as the interest rate falls. If the interest rate continues to fall, that project becomes more and more and more profitable. So, as the interest rate falls, more and more investment projects that a business could undertake become profitable. That is, more and more of them have rates of return that are high enough to cover the interest rate. So at a very high interest rate, the business will undertake very few projects. At a medium interest rate, the business will undertake a larger quantity of projects. And as the interest rate falls still further, the amount of investment spending that businesses will plan to do increases. So we could call this the investment demand curve. That is, how much money do businesses want to spend on capital goods? And investment, I'm using parentheses here to indicate that investment spending is a function in this picture of the rate of interest. High interest rates make investment unprofitable for business. At low interest rates, investments seem like good business, and a larger quantity is invested. Now, anytime I draw a curve in economics, you should ask two questions. Why does it slope the way that it does, and what would cause it to shift? The slope here is due to the inverse relationship between investment and the inverse relationship between the interest rate and the profitability of business investments. So when the interest rate falls, businesses will undertake more projects because they become profitable. The curve would shift anytime businesses find it profitable to do more investment spending at any given rate of interest. So what would cause that? What would cause businesses to decide they wanted to invest in more projects at any given rate of interest? What would cause projects that weren't previously profitable at 20% to suddenly make sense for the business and suddenly be profitable? Well, that would include things such as technological change that allow the business to get more mileage out of an investment. Maybe taxes are lower. Maybe increases overall in the profitability of the business. Anything that would cause the business to be able to make more money from a given investment would cause that business to be willing to pay higher interest rates to acquire the money to undertake that investment. So any factors that make business more desirable, changes in expectations and the like, will shift out the investment demand curve. Now, the last thing we want to do is take this analysis over to our aggregate expenditure picture and show how changes in investment spending are going to influence aggregate expenditure? Well, here's the picture that we've looked at before with consumption spending represented by this red line, the slope being the marginal propensity to consume. If we add on investment spending to this picture, we have to add it on to consumption so that aggregate expenditure is the sum of consumer spending and business spending. So here we have it, a red curve that represents C plus I, consumption spending plus business spending. The slope is the same as the slope of the consumption curve. That's because in our story, investment spending does not depend on income. It's independent of income. It's influenced by the interest rate. It's influenced by expectations. It's influenced by lots of things, taxes, free trade agreements, but none of those things are in this picture. And therefore, if we were to draw the investment curve itself, it would simply be a flat horizontal line. It's independent of the level of income. When we add that horizontal line onto consumption, we get aggregate expenditure, a curve with the same slope as the consumption function, and a difference between these two that's equal to the amount of investment. So if we add investment onto consumption, we get aggregate expenditure, and there you have it. Now, I want to make one more point before I look at some historical data as a way of wrapping up this discussion, and that is that there are two kinds of business spending. There is planned spending and there is actual spending. The difference between actual business spending and planned business spending is unplanned spending. And in our story about the macroeconomy, unplanned business spending is the unintended accumulation of inventories. Businesses plan to purchase a certain number of computers and equipment and build factories, but they don't plan for a shortfall in demand that leaves them stranded with a bunch of products. Whenever they find themselves stranded with these products, they put them in their warehouses as inventory, but this is unintended inventory. A certain amount of inventory accumulation may be planned upon, but when there is a shortfall in demand, businesses are stuck with unintended inventory investment. And this concept is going to come back as we look in detail at the way equilibrium is calculated. But finally, let's look at this picture of some real data from the economy. Let's look at what happens to investment spending over the business cycle. And it's interesting because gross investment spending, the total amount of money that businesses spend on capital equipment, is much more volatile than changes in gross domestic product. That is, when gross domestic product changes, inventory usually changes in a much more erratic way. Why would that be? It's because that during a downturn or a contraction, businesses are very quick to cut back investment spending. They say there's no market there, people won't buy the product, so why should we be building a wing onto our factory? But in a boom, when good times are coming and the market is looking strong, businesses are very quick to ramp up by going out and acquiring plant and equipment to take advantage of the strong economy. So something to notice here as we're seeking to explain the business cycle is that inventory and plant and equipment, investment spending, the spending of businesses, is much more volatile, much more erratic than the business cycle as a whole. Gross domestic product varies, but not by as much as business spending. Now we're ready to analyze the equilibrium in the Keynesian model of the macroeconomy. Pay close attention, because once you've mastered this, you'll have a very powerful tool for understanding and explaining how the economy works. Remember, Keynes's view is based on demand, and at the heart of the circular flow of goods and services in the economy is the relationship between consumers and businesses. So we're going to start by thinking about the balance between consumers and businesses, between consumption and income. Here's the flow of resources. Consumers send their labor and capital to the factor markets, where firms buy them, transform them into goods and services that flow back to the households as consumption spending. Households then pay for these goods and services, providing revenue to businesses that allows the businesses to hire the factor of production, putting income in the pockets of consumers. So if this is the only flow in the economy, if we start with this simplest possible model of the macroeconomy, it must be true that the top half of this flow has exactly the same magnitude, the same size, the same number as the bottom half of this flow. Where do businesses get the money that they pay consumers as income? They get it when consumers buy the goods and services. So in this simple model, the equilibrium, the stable outcome, the balance is when consumption spending is exactly equal to real income. That's the notion here that gives us balance. If that's the case, then the economy is stable. If that's not the case, if consumption spending is greater than income, then consumers are trying to buy more stuff than the factories are actually creating. It's because what the factories are actually creating determines this. It's the goods and services that the companies have produced that allow them to earn the money that they're paying to the households as income. So if consumers are trying to spend more than they're getting in income, the economy is out of balance. Factories are not producing enough, and they might have to scramble to produce more. In the short run, their inventories are going to be drawn down, and they're going to be forced into a position of unintended inventory reduction. So the only way we have a stable or balanced outcome is when consumer spending is equal to real income. Let's look at a numerical example now and see how this would work. Let's go back to our consumption function. This tells you what consumers are planning to spend as a function of their real income. At any given level of real income, consumers are going to spend A, the autonomous consumption, plus B, the marginal propensity to consume times real income. So in our example, let's suppose that autonomous consumption is equal to 10. And let's further suppose that the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.8 or 0.8. Consumers spend 80 cents out of each additional dollar that they're paid in income. Well, if that's the case, if income is 40 and autonomous consumption is 10, then consumers are going to spend 0.8 times 40, or 32, plus 10, the autonomous consumption. 10 plus 32 gives total consumer spending of 42. In that case, consumers are spending more than their income, so savings is going to be -2. We could go ahead and put that in our table. Suppose now that income is higher at 50. In this case, autonomous consumption plus the marginal propensity to consume times 50, 0.8 times 50 is 40 plus 10, gives us total consumer spending of 50, which in this case is exactly equal to income, so savings is equal to 0. If income were higher, say 90, 90 times 0.8 is 72, plus 10 is total consumer spending of 82. In this case, since income is greater than consumption, we find that total savings is going to be equal to 8, a positive number. And finally, if income is 100, 100 times 0.8 is equal to 80, plus autonomous consumption of 10 gives total consumption of 90, leaving savings to total 10. Now, right now, there's nowhere for savings to go in this economy. That is, if consumers put money in the bank, if they take some of their income and don't spend it, then there will be goods left on the store shelves that are not purchased. So that can't be an equilibrium. Businesses are accumulating inventory against their will, unplanned inventory investment. So in this simple model, where our only circular flow is with household spending and income coming in, it must be true that consumption and income are equal in equilibrium. Therefore, our stable outcome is going to involve an income of 50 and a consumption of 50 and a savings of 0. That's the outcome that gives us stability. Let's go and look at that outcome now in the picture that we've drawn called the aggregate expenditure diagram. In this case, we're going to have a consumption function with an intercept of A, which in our case is 10, and a marginal propensity to consume of B, which in our case is 0.8. So here's the consumption function, C as a function of Y, income. Now let's look at this point where the consumption function crosses the aggregate expenditure equals income line right here. Here we have macroeconomic equilibrium. That is, at this level of output, Y, which in our story we've calculated to be 50, something very interesting happens. At this level of output, we have consumers getting an income of 50, planning to do consumption of 50, so that total consumer spending, which in this story is the very sum of aggregate expenditure, since consumers are the only people we've got in our model so far, aggregate expenditure is equal to income. Consumers are planning to spend an amount of money, 50, that generates an income, 50, on which these spending plans are based. That's the notion of macroeconomic equilibrium. When people are planning to spend an amount of money that generates the income on which the spending plans are based. The top of the circular flow balances the bottom of the circular flow. Consumption expenditures are equal to income. If income were higher, say income were up here at some higher level like 100, if income were up here at 100, then we would have the situation of consumption spending only being 90, as we calculated in our table, but income is 100. So we have unintended inventory investment. Businesses are producing more goods and services than consumers are planning to buy at an income of 100. Therefore, we don't have equilibrium. Inventories accumulate. Businesses are going to cut back production in order to, in response to this excess supply of goods and services, until finally we get back to an equilibrium at which planned investment is equal to zero, in this case, in which planned spending, consumer spending, is equal to income. On the other hand, if income were lower, say it were somewhere down here at 40, then consumers are planning to spend 42, but income is only 40. There's not enough stuff to satisfy consumer demand. In that case, inventories are being drawn down, and businesses have to produce more goods and services to satisfy consumer demand, and as they increase their production of goods and services, income will increase until we return to 50, the stable income, the equilibrium in this model. Now, that's an approach that focuses on consumer spending. One way of describing macroeconomic equilibrium is consumer spending equals income. Consumers are planning to spend an amount of money that creates the income on which the plans are created, on which the plans are based. Now, there's another way of explaining this. We've seen that when you have a consumption function, you can also draw a savings function. And the savings function has an intercept that has the same magnitude but the opposite sign. So the intercept of our savings function is -10, and the slope of our savings function is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, or the marginal propensity to save, which in this case, as we've seen before, is 0.2. Now, the savings function in this case has an intercept right here. Savings is equal to 0 when income is equal to 50. That is, as we saw from the table a moment ago, when income is 50, people are planning to spend all of their income on consumer goods and services, leaving savings equals to 0. So one way of explaining equilibrium in this case is if there's nowhere for savings to go, if businesses don't want to borrow it, the government doesn't want to borrow it, if there's no one else in the model who might use your savings, then in equilibrium, savings has to be 0. Consumers have to be spending all of the income that they get. Otherwise, either stuff is piling up on the shelves at the stores, or businesses are having to take stuff out of their inventories to satisfy extra consumer demand. So one way of seeing the equilibrium here is saying that if consumers are the only players in the market, savings has to be equal to 0, because there's no one else to use the savings. Well, let's now introduce savings more deliberately into the model and think about how savings really work in the macroeconomy. We'll go back to our circular flow diagram and introduce savings into the picture. So here's my icon for savings. Savings are a leakage out of the system. That is, this is money that consumers could be spending on goods and services, but instead they're choosing to put this into the bank as savings. Now, who's going to use this savings? See, if the savings were here, if there were a positive amount of savings, as we saw in our table a minute ago, and no one to use it, then we'll have disequilibrium, because consumers are getting income that they're not spending on goods and services, and our wheel, our circular flow, is out of balance. But suppose we introduce businesses, and suppose businesses acquire consumer savings and then spend it on plant and equipment, that is, so-called investment spending. If businesses acquire savings and then use them to buy the stuff in the market that consumers aren't buying, that can restore balance to the circular flow. Here's how it works. Savings are a leakage out of the circular flow, but business spending, investment spending, is an injection back into the circular flow. So we label here this investment spending, And the way it works in our model is investment spending balances the reduction in consumption that created the savings. So if there's 10 worth of savings and business spending is equal to 10, then the circular flow balances once again. The stuff that consumers don't buy when they divert some of their income into their savings account is purchased by businesses when they borrow that savings and use it to acquire plant, equipment, and other capital goods. So one way of thinking about an equilibrium condition when you have savings, when you have this leakage, is that in equilibrium it must be true that what leaks out flows back in. In equilibrium, savings has to equal investment. Well, there you have it. Another way of describing macroeconomic equilibrium. In our simple story, we had zero savings, that is, everything was spent. Therefore, in equilibrium, since savings is zero, investment spending would have to be equal to zero for everything to balance. Let's go back to our numbers now and suppose that we have savings in the economy. If we have savings in the economy, then we have something for businesses to borrow to conduct their investment purchases. So let's suppose that businesses want to spend 10. That is, the investment spending that they're planning to do is 10 at any level of income. Well, if that's the case, the only equilibrium that we can have is one where consumers are willing to reduce their consumption spending relative to their income by enough to create savings for businesses to use. If the businesses want 10 worth of investment spending, there has to be 10 worth of savings to give us balance. Now our equilibrium is going to be 100. An equilibrium income level of 100, because only when equilibrium income is 100 is there enough of a gap between planned consumption and income to create the savings that satisfy businesses' demand for investment spending. That is, when businesses increase their investment spending by 10, they will generate enough income so that consumers will do the savings that will satisfy their need for capital. Here's another way of seeing the equilibrium condition. If you take investment spending and add it to consumer spending, 90 plus 10 is 100. Aggregate expenditure is equal to income. Or, equivalently, we can say we have equilibrium because the amount of money that people are saving is equal to the amount of investment spending that businesses want to do. Let's go over and look at that in a diagram. Here we have it in the diagram. Right now we've only got consumption spending, but now we're going to add on investment spending. So suppose we increase aggregate expenditure by the amount of investment, and in this case, that's equal to 10. So I shift my line upwards by 10, and now I have aggregate expenditure as a function of income, and it's 10 higher than my consumption function. Same slope, because investment spending is independent of the level of income. Well, look, now my equilibrium point, the point at which the red line crosses the black dotted line, has shifted way up here. That is, now we have a balance between total planned spending and total income at an income level of 100, much higher than our original equilibrium income level. Another way to see this is if we look in the diagram downstairs, and I put investment spending in this picture, investors, that is businesses buying capital goods, are planning to spend a total of 10. Well, that means that at an income level of 100, we get enough savings generated by this high income level to satisfy businesses' need to borrow money. That is, only when the income level is 100 are consumers willing to save enough money, the gap between the dotted black line and the consumption function. Only whenever that gap has risen to a level of 10 is there enough extra money being saved by people so that businesses can go to the bank, borrow it, and do the 10 worth of investment spending that they're planning to do. Only whenever savings equals investment do we have macroeconomic equilibrium. See, it's kind of interesting. There are two ways of describing equilibrium in that circular flow. One is to say that spending equals income. That is, the sum of consumer spending plus business spending is equal to the total income that's created. A second way, an equally good way, is to say that what leaks out has to flow back in. That is, savings is equal to investment spending. Notice, as you look at this picture, that both pictures are telling the same story, just from different perspectives. Let me summarize by writing this out in an equation, and I think this equation will help make it clear how the spending approach is exactly equal to the savings approach in explaining macroeconomic equilibrium. In our simplest model, it must be true that output is equal to consumption. Well, you know that income is equal to what you save plus what you spend. Remember, there's only two uses of your income, and that's consumption and savings. And what it is that you don't spend, you must be saving. Well, if that's the case, then in the simplest version, if we set income equal to each other in these two equations, we get consumption equals S plus C, or savings must equal 0. If you're only spenders or households, then it must be an equilibrium that savings is equal to 0. Now, if we add another set of spenders, that is, if we add business spenders to our equation, then aggregate expenditure in equilibrium has to equal income. So consumption plus investment spending, our aggregate expenditure, set that equal to income. That's your condition for equilibrium. But it still has to be true that the total income that's received in the economy is equal to savings plus consumption. So if you set y equal to y, you get C plus I is equal to C plus S, or savings equals investment. They have to be equal in equilibrium. You've heard the story intuitively and seen it in the circular flow diagram. I've given you a simple numerical example. Then I drew diagrams to show you how the spending approach is equal to the savings approach. And finally, we use this simple algebra. The idea here is there are two ways of describing macroeconomic equilibrium. In one, you focus on the flow of spending, and you say what consumers are spending has to be equal to their income. In the second approach, you focus on what's leaking out of that wheel, and you say that everything that leaks out has to go back in at some point. The spending approach, the savings approach. Two ways of talking about when the economy is in balance. Here's a question. How will a change in autonomous spending affect equilibrium output in the economy? That is, suppose you go out and for no good reason increase your autonomous consumption spending by $16. Just on a whim. Maybe the stock market has boomed, maybe your animal spirits move you, and you just go out and buy a compact disc for $16. If we follow through the consequences of that choice, what will be the effect on gross domestic product of that purchase? Well, think about it for a moment. You go to the record store and you spend $16. Now the guy who runs the record store has $16 in income that he didn't have before. He spends part of it and he saves the rest. The part that he spends, maybe on ice cream, becomes the income of the proprietor of the ice cream store. She saves part of it and spends the rest. What she spends becomes the income of someone maybe at a t-shirt stand. He saves part of it and spends the rest. So your one act of spending sets in motion a process that creates income and motivates spending for a lot of other people. This is what we call the multiplier effect. When there is an increase in autonomous spending, real gross domestic product, equilibrium income, increases by much more than the original increase in spending. A small increase in spending can catalyze a large increase in equilibrium income, equilibrium output. Let's see how it works. Let's go through our example carefully. You go to the record store and you spend $16. So your increase in consumption creates an increase in income of $16 for the person who owns the record store. So that's going to influence his consumption. And let's suppose, for the sake of making this example really simple, we take a marginal propensity to consume equal to 50%. That is, everybody is going to spend 1/2 of any new income they get. So the guy who runs the record store gets $16 worth of income, and let's suppose that he puts half of it immediately into the bank and spends the rest. So what he's going to do is he's going to go, having put half of this into the bank, he's going to spend half of this amount, or $8, let's say at the ice cream store. So he's now increased the income of the ice cream store proprietor by $8. The rest of this went into the bank. So now that this $8 has been spent at the ice cream store, it becomes the income of the ice cream proprietor. She takes this money and she thinks, I just got $8. Well, my marginal propensity to consume is 50%, so I'm going to put half of it in the bank and save it. The other 50% I'm going to spend. So she goes and buys a T-shirt that costs $4, and that $4 becomes the income of the guy who runs the T-shirt stand. So he now has $4 in income, and he thinks to himself, well, I better put 2 of it into the bank, and the other 2 I can spend. So he spends 2 and saves 2, and the process continues. That becomes someone else's income, who saves half and increases spending by $1, which becomes someone else's income, and so forth, until finally we've got down to little increases in income that are so small that they hardly matter. Well, what has been the total increase in income that resulted from that original expenditure of $16? Well, you created $16 worth of income for the record salesman, 8 for the ice cream salesman, 4 for the T-shirt salesman, 2 for somebody else, 1 for somebody else, 1 half, 1 quarter, and so forth, until the pieces are so small that you can't even pick them up anymore. Well, let's add it all up. 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1 half plus 1 quarter plus 1/8 plus and so forth, until the pieces are so little that you just can't even handle them anymore. And it adds up to, look, a bar that's exactly twice as big as the original expenditure. That is, the total amount of income that's created, if we add up all of these incremental increases in income, is equal to 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1. And eventually, if we keep adding up those smaller and smaller fractions, we're going to get a total of 32. That's the sum. Now, that's the total amount of gross domestic product increase that resulted from the original expenditure of 16. How does it work? It works because your spending becomes someone else's income. They're going to save part of it and spend part of it, creating income for someone else. And eventually, when you add up the pieces, this is what you get. Now, where does that number come from? Where does that multiplier number come from? There are 2 ways that we can derive the multiplier. First of all, let me define the multiplier carefully. The multiplier in Keynesian analysis is equal to the change in equilibrium gross domestic product that results from a change in autonomous spending. This change in autonomous spending can be an increase in autonomous consumption, an increase in business investment spending, an increase in government spending, an increase in net export spending, anything that increases autonomously, that is on its own, that's independent from income. Any increase in autonomous spending gives rise to a multiplier through this process. That is, one person's spending becomes another person's income until you've got a multiple of the autonomous spending created in new gross domestic product. Well, let's see where that number comes from, and there are really 2 ways for us to derive the multiplier. Method number 1 of deriving the multiplier is what we call a geometric sequence. That is, the change in equilibrium income is equal to the change in autonomous spending times 1. This is the amount of money you spend at the record store, $16 times 1, plus the marginal propensity to consume. This is how much the record salesman spent. He put part of his money in savings, and he spent 1/2, plus marginal propensity to consume squared. This is how much the person who owned the ice cream stand spent. She got half of what you spent, because the guy at the record store saved part, and then she spent half of it herself. So the number's squared, and then cubed, and so forth, and it keeps adding up forever. Well, a geometric sequence like this has a nice, simple expression. That is, if you have a formula that's 1 plus b squared plus b cubed plus b to the 4th and so forth forever and ever, if b is a fraction, that eventually converges to this, 1 over 1 minus b. Imagine that b is 1/2, like in our example. 1/2, if you subtract it from 1, gives you 1/2, and the reciprocal of 1/2 is 2. That is, we wound up with twice as much as the original change in autonomous spending. So the marginal propensity to consume in this equation is B, and if we manipulate this a little bit, we can see that the change in real gross domestic product that results from a change in autonomous spending is equal to this multiplier. So that's one way to do it, and that way will be more fun if you know something about geometric sequences. But the trick is knowing that this formula right here eventually converges to this if you add all the terms together. There's an easier way that uses just simple algebra, and that starts with output is equal to C plus I. In our simple model, we have two components of aggregate expenditure, consumers and businesses. And also we know that consumption is equal to A plus B times Y. That is, we have a simple linear consumption function with an autonomous component and with a marginal propensity to consume, B, the fraction of each additional dollar that you spend on consumer goods. We'll substitute this equation up here into this one, and you get Y is equal to A plus B, Y plus I. And if you subtract so as to get the Y terms on one side of the equation together, and here we have, let's see, this is equal to 1 minus B times Y equals A plus I, and that gives us that Y is equal to 1 over 1 minus B times these two terms taken together. I'll scoot this over so I can get this all on one page, and I've got A plus I. And there's your multiplier effect. That output is going to be equal to 1 over 1 minus B times A plus I. That is, if A increases or if I increases, if either of these components of autonomous spending increase, then Y is going to increase by a multiple of that. The coefficient on both of these autonomous components is 1 over 1 minus B. So the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus B. Any change in A, any change in I, any change in any of these autonomous components of spending increases Y by a multiple of that amount. And the coefficient is 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Now, let's look at how this plays out in our diagram. We've used this diagram before, and we can show the effect of an increase in investment spending on equilibrium output. Let's start here. And let's suppose that we have, in this case, a different formula, that consumption is equal to 10 plus 0.8 times Y. This is the consumption function that we've used in our numerical example before. And we saw that if we have consumer spending as our only component of spending, that equilibrium income in that case is equal to 50. So I could go over here and write that on this axis, but I don't want to clutter my diagram. Now, let's suppose we add investment spending. So if investment spending is equal to 10, I would have to add on another spending term down here. Here's the investment line, and it's going to be equal to 10, and it's autonomous. That is, it doesn't depend on Y. So no matter what your level of GDP is, businesses are planning to spend $10 on investment. So let's add 10 onto the consumption function, which shifts it up by this vertical distance. Okay? So here we have our change in investment spending. It's gone from 0 to 10, and we calculated last time that we saw from our table in a previous example that if you increased investment spending from 0 to 10, that the equilibrium level of output rose from 50 to 100. Well, how do you figure that? Here's the change in income down here, and here was the change in investment. The change in investment spending was from 0 to 10, so that's only equal to 10. The change in income is from 50 to 100, that's equal to 50. Where do you get that? Well, in this case, the multiplier is going to be 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, which is 0.8. So the multiplier in this case should be the change in output that results from a change in business spending is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.8. Well, 0.8 from 1 leaves 2 tenths. 2 tenths, 20% is 1/5, and the reciprocal of 1/5 is equal to 5. So in this particular case, our multiplier is going to be equal to 5. Well, look, that's exactly what happened. We increased income by 50 after we increased investment by 10. So the ratio of this change in equilibrium income, 50, to the change in investment spending, 10, is 5. How did it happen? It happened because when businesses from the original equilibrium decide that they want to buy $10 more worth of stuff, well, there's not $10 more worth of stuff for them to buy. So businesses have to increase their production in order to meet this extra demand. And whenever they increase their production by 10, they create $10 worth of additional income, which does what? It motivates people to spend more. And how much more do they spend? They spend $10 worth of income times 8/10, which is the marginal propensity to consume, they add $8 to their total consumption plan. Well, that then creates excess demand for goods, so businesses have to produce more stuff. Then people decide, with this new income they got from the increase in production, to spend more. And things keep going until finally output has increased, not just by the original $10 to satisfy businesses' demand for investment goods, but by a full $50 after you take into account the multiplier effect. Businesses created additional demand of $10, but that put income into the workers' pockets, who went out and spent more, which created more demand and more income and more demand and more income, until finally the pieces get so small that you can't even pick them up. And that's whenever you've converged to a new equilibrium. So that's the way this process works. You've seen it with a simple example with my red bars, in which if we use 1/2 as our MPC, we wound up with twice as much new income as the original change in autonomous spending. You've seen it in algebra. You've seen that the multiplier is the coefficient on equilibrium output whenever there's a change in autonomous spending. And finally, you've seen it in the diagram. When you shift the line up, the new equilibrium point involves a much bigger increase in income than we had increase in autonomous spending. The trick here is the marginal propensity to consume. That's what the multiplier depends on. When there's an increase in autonomous spending, that creates income, and part of it is going to be spent, part of it saved. But the part that's spent creates income for somebody else, which means they're going to spend part of it and save part of it, which creates income for someone else, and so forth. And when all the dust settles, you wind up with this, a multiplier. And the multiplier tells you the change in equilibrium income that results from a change in autonomous spending. We're building Keynes's model of the macroeconomy. It's a model that's driven by demand. If people won't buy stuff, then it accumulates on store shelves, and when factories cut back their production, people are laid off work. The economy keeps adjusting until we find an equilibrium. In this equilibrium, the spending plans of consumers, businesses, the government, and foreigners add up to create an income on which those spending plans are based. That is, we get a stable circular flow between what people are planning to spend and the goods and services that are actually produced by factories to meet the demand. That's macroeconomic equilibrium. To understand macroeconomic equilibrium, we have to look at the plans that consumers, businesses, the government, and foreigners make. Those plans are based on, for example, consumer income, interest rates, and other environmental factors in the economy. We've been thinking about the consumption function, and now we're going to discuss another way of describing consumer behavior, because it turns out that you can just as easily describe consumer behavior in terms of savings as you can describe it in terms of spending. That's because consumer income can be used in one of three ways. When you get a paycheck, there's only three things you can do with it. You can either spend it, in which case we call it consumption. You can put it in a mutual fund or in the bank, in which case we call it savings. Or the government can take it, in which case we call it taxes. These three components add up to consumer income. Consumers spend, they save, and they pay taxes. Now, for the time being, we're going to assume that consumers are not paying taxes, that is, taxes are equal to zero. And in that case, consumer spending and consumer saving add up to the total of consumer income. Well, once you've seen this relationship, a kind of complementarity becomes obvious. That is, consumer savings is just as accurate a description of consumer behavior and just as complete as is consumer spending. Let's go back to the numbers that we considered in the consumption schedule in a previous exercise. Here we have income equal to 40 and consumer spending equal to 42. That means that the consumer is spending $2 more than his income in this period, which means that he's drawing down his savings by $2. That is, this savings is enabling the consumer to spend more than his income. If income is 50 and consumer spending is 50, then savings is equal to 0, a kind of break-even point. And if consumer income is equal to 80 and consumer spending is equal to 74, then that means the savings is equal to 6. The consumer is putting some money into the bank. Here you see this complementary relation between consumption and savings. Now, before, we described consumer spending in a function, an algebraic equation that we called the consumption function. Now what we're going to do is look at a relationship between the consumption function and the savings function. That is, once you know how the consumer behaves, you can describe also the savings function. Let's look now at this relationship. Output, which is consumer income, is equal to consumption plus savings. We also know that consumption is equal to A, autonomous consumption, plus B, which is the marginal propensity to consume, multiplied by Y, which is income. Well, both of these things are true. Therefore, if we plug this description of consumption into the previous equation, we can get this. Y is equal to A plus B times Y plus S. And if we solve this equation for S, let's see what we get. Minus A, I get that by moving A to the other side of the equation. I move BY to the other side of the equation, and I get 1 minus B times Y is equal to S. If I move everything over to the left-hand side except for savings, this is the equation that I get. Savings is equal to minus A plus 1 minus B times Y. Let's take a moment and see if there isn't some intuition in all of these symbols. Well, think about it. Anything that the consumers are going to be spending at zero income, that is the autonomous component of consumption, is going to be equal to dis-savings. That is, if income is equal to 0 and the consumers have to have food, clothing, and other necessary expenditures equal to A, the only way they can get that is to draw down their savings. So autonomous consumption is going to be equal to autonomous dis-savings. This is what you have to take out of your savings account when income is 0 to meet your basic needs. The next thing to think about is this slope. Up here, B represents the fraction of each additional dollar that you spend on consumption goods and services. That means that what you're doing with the rest must be savings. So if B is the fraction that you are consuming, then 1 minus B is the fraction of an additional dollar that you are saving. So you see here that B, the marginal propensity to consume, plus 1 minus B, the marginal propensity to save, is equal to 1. Every additional dollar that you get is broken into its two possible uses. One fraction of it you're going to consume, and one fraction of it you're going to save. In the example we looked at previously, the fraction that was consumed of each additional dollar was 80 cents, or 0.8. That means that the marginal propensity to save in this case is 0.2. For every additional dollar you receive, you're going to save 20 cents. The marginal propensity to consume is 1 minus the marginal propensity to save. The marginal propensity to save is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Every dollar is divided into the part that's spent and the part that's saved. And the two propensities, the two fractions, add up to 1. Now, since that's the case, we're able to do some calculations based on the numbers that we used in our previous example. So if it's true that consumption is equal to 10 plus 8/10 times Y, then savings is going to be equal to minus 10 plus 0.2 times Y. You can see where I got this. If you take this amount of consumption and you subtract this formula from Y, S equals Y minus C equals Y minus this formula for consumption. And if you go ahead and do the algebra here, you get Y, take the minus sign into the parenthesis, Y minus 8/10 Y is 2/10 Y, and there's no constant outside, so your constant is going to be left at minus 10. Savings is minus 10 plus 2/10 times Y. There's the savings formula. Now let's take this algebra and carry it back over to the graphs that we've seen earlier, because we're going to see now a graphical complementarity between savings and consumption. Previously, we wrote consumption on the vertical axis as a function of income on the horizontal axis, and we drew it out, graphing it as this linear function. Here's my intercept of 10, my autonomous consumption, what you spend even with zero income, and the slope of my consumption curve is going to be rise over the run. The rise here is the change in consumption, the run is the change in income, and the change in consumption that results from the change in income is equal to the marginal propensity to consume, which we've labeled with the letter B, the slope in our consumption diagram. Now, the savings curve is going to look like the complement of that picture. Down here we have the intercept, which is negative 10, because if income is 0 and you're spending 10, that means when income is 0, you must be saving negative 10. So if we represent savings as a vertical coordinate, as a function of income, the horizontal coordinate, when income is 0, savings is minus 10. Let's find another point on the savings curve. Well, look at this point right here. When consumption is equal to income, that is, when the red line crosses the black dotted line, savings is equal to 0. The black dotted line indicates all of those points here where consumption is equal to income. Those are all the points that are on that line. So if consumption, the planned consumer spending, is equal to the income that consumers receive, planned savings will be equal to 0. Therefore, since this curve is linear and has a slope of 1 minus b, we can go ahead and draw the savings function. Here's savings as a function of income, just like up here we have consumption as a function of income. We now have a slope of the change in savings that results from a change in income. The slope of this curve is equal to the marginal propensity to save. The change in savings that results from the change in income is the marginal propensity to save. And in this case, the marginal propensity to save is going to be 1 minus b. Look, there's a nice complementary relationship between these two curves. For any given income level, now let's pick an income level, say y sub 0. If we go up the diagram, the amount by which consumption, the red curve, exceeds income, the black curve, is going to be equal to the amount of savings. This gap upstairs is equal to this same vertical gap downstairs. For any given income level, the difference between consumption, the red curve, and income, the black dotted curve, is going to be the amount of savings, which is seen in the downstairs diagram. Where consumption crosses income in the upstairs diagram, savings is equal to 0. Over on this side of the break-even point, in this region up here, savings is going to be less than 0. That is, consumers are dissaving in order to finance the excess of consumption over income. And if we're on this side of the dotted line, savings is going to be positive. That is, since consumers are spending less than their total income, there's actually money, as we can see down here, being put into the bank. So it's pretty easy to see here the complementary relationship between consumption and savings. There's one more term that I want to define, and that is average propensity to consume. Average propensity to consume is your total consumption divided by your total income. The average propensity to consume is the fraction of their total income that consumers are spending. Remember, marginal propensity to consume is how much you spend out of each additional dollar. But the average propensity to consume is your total overall spending as a fraction of your total overall income. We can say the same thing about savings. S over Y is the average propensity to save, the fraction of your income that you're saving. Whereas the change in saving that results from a change in income is called the marginal propensity to save. Just as the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save add up to 1, the average propensity to consume and the average propensity to save also add up to 1. Out of every dollar you get, part of it is going to be spent, part of it is going to be saved. Whether you're talking about your total income or whether you're talking about a marginal dollar that you get, you make a decision about what fraction to spend and what fraction to save. In the United States right now, our average propensity to consume is about 0.95. That is, on average, we're saving only about 5 cents out of every dollar. and in recent months it's been even lower than that. The complementary relationship between consumption and savings helps us then to begin to build a model of how macroeconomic forces interact.